Hello, thanks for joining us for another episode from our 2025 eMTB Shootout here at Zion Mountain Ranch. Stay tuned today while we talk about an exciting prototype that we begged, pleaded, asked Haro to let us bring to the shootout this year, a prototype Haro eGreer, and we are excited that we brought it. So stay tuned. Let's get into this bike. So before we dive into the details and how this bike performed, we'd like to take a quick minute and thank our sponsors for making this series possible. Thanks to Fox Racing for not only kitting us out to look good, you look all right, but I think the rest of us look pretty good. And of course, keeping us safe on the trail with some great helmets and knee pads. Schwalbe Tires, thank you for supplying us with the Albert rear, Magic Mary front. We've got the gravity casing tires, soft compound in the new radial construction, which has been rad. Velocirax has helped step up as our rack sponsor, ensuring we can transport all these e-bikes from destination to destination. And speaking of destinations, Zion Mountain Ranch has been our host for the final 2 weeks of testing here on the back steps of Zion National Park. They've got a great trail network right here just off the property, great food and amazing cabins. So make sure you check out Zion Mountain Ranch if you're passing through Utah and looking for a fun place to ride. So let's get into the E Greer. Robert, you want to talk specs and details a little bit?
Yeah, so before I get into the E Greer, I'd like to say that I'm not particularly stoked on you calling me out for not looking great. I think I look fantastic. I really like this color of light blue, and it happens to match this E Greer. 160mm rear travel, 170mm fork, MX wheels only, Bosch Gen 5 drive unit with a 600 watt-hour battery, which is kind of semi-easily removable. You do have to take off the bash guard that would normally be fitted on there.
E-bikes, they should really get good quality skid plates, because you skid them on things, usually sharp, hard things.
It was, in fairness, a 3D printed prototype to go on there. Definitely wasn't the final production strength, at least I would hope. And then, yeah, we don't actually have anything like a production spec. It's a bit of a mismatch of the top two specs. We also don't currently have the pricing, but we will be sure to stick it on the screen here when we get that, just to confirm what the build specs are going to be. But in typical Haro style, I'd imagine it's going to be fairly reasonable value. Carbon fiber frame, and
not spray painted.
Well, no, sadly. I mean,
Yeah,
I think this looks awesome. I think it's for sure the best paint
The
job that we
overspray
have.
on the fork and the cranks adds a real nice touch.
And before you challenge us for it, it wasn't us who scratched it up that bad. It arrived to us in a box with no padding on it. Cool. Would you like to talk through any of the geometry figures that stand out to you?
Yeah, I think one of the things specifically riding this bike that made a big impact for me was the steeper seat angle. Really nice upright riding position. Outside of that, like, it's kind of just what you'd expect from a more play-focused enduro e-mountain bike to be.
Absolutely.
63.8 degree head angle, so sweet spot of slack and stable, but also not overly slack, keeping the Haro vibes alive.
Well, what's the biggest Haro vibe on the back of it?
Yeah, the very short chain stays.
Shortest on test, 435 mil.
Which is across the board.
Yeah.
It whips around corners. But we will get into that.
Definitely not a bike that has been designed to just be like a stable plow machine. Haro being a BMX company first and foremost, trying to instill a little bit of their playful nature with it, I'd say.
I would say a huge contrast to the bike we reviewed just before that, which is the Gas, right? That is the long plow machine. And yeah, coincidentally, that bike's got a 475 reach. This has a 485 reach, yet the wheelbase is like massively shorter, thanks to the short stays. But 5'11", 6'2"-ish. I think we all felt really comfortable and happy on this bike and really enjoyed how it performed. So I guess, normally in most of our reviews, we'd kind of next talk about setup, fit, finish, being that this is a prototype from, I think, probably the linkage to the 3D printed, motor guard and the spray paint. Probably can't touch on that a ton on this bike, but overall, I would say hardware stayed tight. Linkage is still tight. Everything looks like once it gets to be a final product, which is hopefully going to be very, very soon, I think this is going to be a pretty solid all-around build.
Yeah, I believe these are coming, going to be available later in the summer. So definitely not far out. I think just this was one of the very first bikes that they received themselves. I know that Haro is actually begging us to give it back to them because all of their teams actually want to get on it. I think we've been riding it before most of their riders have had a chance to. So yeah, we're very thankful to Haro for the
I
opportunity.
think for setup for me on this bike, you know, you look at the paint job and kind of what it's designed to do. It was like, yeah, that pressure's good enough. That'll work. And it kind of just worked just from basic parking lot bounces, and, you know, got out on the trail and just had a blast.
In that way, you're saying it's not a bike that needs a very specific focused in setup. It's, you know, get it to that 30% sag range, stick your fork pressure that you know you need, and then it's good to go. Just sort of a fuss-free BMX inspired nature.
Yeah, it's definitely a bike that, like, you know, where you say look at something like the Levo, right? And I think the Levo consumer is probably not even going to buy this because they're like, it's a Haro. You know what I mean? I think for the rider who is interested in the Haro, they're going to either have a BMX or kind of like an older school vibe and mentality. They're maybe going to be a little more free ride play focused. Not that this bike is limited to that, because we definitely rode it down some DH tracks and it performs. But to your point, you kind of just want to get on this thing and just abuse it. You want to land it sideways. You want to tap stuff. You want to flick it, and it rewards very, very well.
Do you think the drive unit selection for this bike is a good fit?
I mean, Bosch Gen 5, it's just a solid drive unit, very adaptable, tunable, now with 100 newton meters of torque and 750 watts of peak power. But you don't need to have all of that. It does only have a 600 watt hour battery. You can, of course, add the 250 watt hour range extender to that to boost it considerably for a bigger day in the saddle. But yeah, I mean, it's just such a well-controlled drive unit. It runs silently. It's fuss-free. Like, you wouldn't need to take this bike and get into the app and change everything. You can just plug it in, stick it in the eMTB mode and go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think a very good fit and a sensible choice by Haro for sure.
Very much, yeah.
And the 600 watt battery is a perfect fit for this bike.
For sure. Yeah, it's maybe not going to be the bike that you're taking for the longest all-day epic mission where you need a bigger battery, but to give that agility and the playful nature, it's perfect, and still takes you pretty far, especially if you're conserving battery a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've definitely done some big rides on 600 watt hour batteries for sure.
Climbing performance goal, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I was well surprised at how comfortable it was climbing. Those shorter stays do come into a factor when things get steep, but on some of those more ledgy tech climbs we were doing, that helped me being able to bunny hop it and lift it up over some of those tech climbs. And I cleaned something that Robert didn't, so sweet on that. And you know, there's some luck involved there, and I think this bike definitely was part of that, and being able to really get my weight off the back and J-hop up onto some of those ledges.
For sure. Drew, do you agree?
Yeah, this bike was a lot of fun, especially, you know, we had, I'd say, a pretty fair balance of technical, rocky, ledgy climbs. We also had quite a lot of single track climbing, and they were tight single tracks. And to me, the short rear end meant that I could get the bike around, you know, with the Bosch drive unit. Like, I would say on this bike, above all others in the test, I was able to like practice my power wheelie 180s around switchbacks, like enter the corner and like halfway through just start pedaling and get the front end around. And like, I just had so much fun. I was like, the whole climb, every corner I was doing it both ways, just wheeling out of it. And I was like, it was just so much fun to climb.
And that's a combo of the short chain stays and the control of the Bosch unit, you'd say?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Short stays probably being the larger of the two, but at least making it more controllable, getting it up on that balance point. But a super comfy suspension platform. And yeah, everything but the steepest climbs where the short stays kind of come to, you know, giving you a little bit harder time to get traction or weighting that front end. But again, I would imagine most people riding this thing, like I said earlier, are either riding fire roads to get to their favorite descents or are just kind of cruising up, you know, multi-use trails before they get to their little bomber DH tracks.
Or jump zones.
Yeah.
Talking of downhill tracks.
So overall, I would say Haro is definitely a fun and playful poppy bike. If you like hipping her out, finding little transfers, trail gaps. Definitely very fun and capable there. Manuals are a blast.
When you get this Haro eGreer onto a descent, every time, I mean, I think before you've even got on the bike, you look at the paint job on this prototype, and you've just got this, like, the BMX nature in the background. I like to try and hang on to the fact that I still have a BMX and very occasionally use it. So I was just getting on this thing, and to start with, you know, we've been riding aggressive enduro bikes on some fairly aggressive terrain, and as a result, I've been with more of a racy, fast, like pushing hard mindset. So I hopped onto this, and I was not quite gelling with it, trying to do that. But then I was like, remember, it's a Haro, like, think BMX, slow things down, pop things harder, play on the back wheel, slash everything. And then I was like, damn, this thing is fun.
Yeah, I think I spent more time on the back wheel of this bike than any other bike, and maybe more than I spent on both wheels on this thing. Like I am sure that probably at least like 75% of the video clips of me going by Dustin and Brian would involve me being on one wheel or completely off the ground. So, you know, for me, as someone who's like, I would say not the best jumper and not the guy who's always, you know, seeking to style out big jumps and more focused on like how to take seconds off and speed, I was still able to go fast and ride this bike through some pretty gnarly downhills, but it definitely made me feel a little more like you guys. Like, I'm gonna do more manuals, or I'm gonna do little pops and hits, and I really, really enjoyed that, and it was cool to kind of maybe get back out of like the less competitive speed space and more into like just ride trail and have fun, and I really had a great time on the bike.
Yeah, I should add that it wasn't that this bike is not capable.
No.
By no means. The suspension platform is pretty dialed, pretty comfortable, still gives you enough support to push hard. It's just, yeah, I think it favors a more playful style, but it will still let you hang on some pretty rough and rowdy terrain, right?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head of like, you know, we're riding a lot of bikes with trying to beat each other's times down the hill, and when you get on this bike and you're still in that same mindset and you get your weight where you think it needs to be, those shorter chain stays come into effect. But when you change that mindset a little bit and go like, hey, I'm just gonna go have fun, it like, the light bulb goes off and the bike just comes alive. And as you were saying, when you are at speed and you've been riding it for, you know, a couple hours and you understand where that weight bias is, it's not slow by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I think I put down a pretty fast run on our DH racetrack actually on this bike. But you know, as the week has progressed, might surprise you guys, we're a little competitive here. Our seconds have ticked away on the leaderboard there, and that's where you start finding like, okay, we're migrating more towards the race bikes for the race day and this bike for the play days. Yeah.
So, ideal consumer?
If you want to jump and just have a good time, and then also still have comfort on longer climbs. You know, with that range extender, you can go out and have a big long day and be very fulfilled. But if someone's looking for the fastest race bike, I'm not going to suggest this to you. But if you're looking for something that is agile, it is fun, and you just really want to put a smile on your face and get some airtime, there's not really a better choice than this bike.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah, I will third that for sure. And, you know, originally being like an LA local and knowing, I've never ridden Greer, but I know the zone. And that's obviously the namesake for the bike. I know what the riding's like, you know, kind of where I was from, riding Simi Valley, like the Rocky Peak trails, G-Spot, and some of the other, you know, more famous trails in that zone. Like, it makes sense that this is very much like kind of a SoCal play jump bike. I don't think it's limited to that region. I could see this bike being a lot of other fun, a lot of other places. I think South Mountain, this thing would absolutely rip some of those trails just outside the Phoenix area. So I think the bike could rip in a lot of spots, even the Pacific Northwest. I think like Santa Cruz, Bellingham, like some of the jumpy, like new school kind of park trails, like Black Rock, this thing would be an absolute blast. So I would definitely say the rider that is less focused on the clock and more focused on the smiles, this thing will deliver for sure.
That brought something to mind is even that old school slow tech with these short stays.
Yes.
You know, you're not going to be held back by a big long bike getting around those corners. So it is very versatile. Yeah.
Well, folks, thanks again to Fox Racing, Schwalbe Tires, Velocirax, and Zion Mountain Ranch. And of course, thanks to Haro for letting us I think, pretty much wrestle this one-of-a-kind prototype out of their Sea Otter booth and bring it here to be tested and beat on for the shootout. Sorry about the bash plate, but I guess it was a 3D printed one anyways, so hopefully you guys can print another one. A bike that I think we would all recommend. Hopefully they'll be out soon. I wouldn't sleep on this thing, dude. It is a blast. If you like having fun, this is an eMTB worth considering. So thank you guys very much for watching. Stay tuned to see how this bike fares against the other 11 bikes in this year's shootout. Thanks again, and we'll see you out on the trails.